The following discussion contains spoilers for the 1980s horror classics The Thing and The Fly. So be warned. John Carpenter's 1982 horror classic, The Thing, is about a mysterious alien entity which infiltrates a research lab in Antarctica. One by one, the creature comes to inhabit the bodies of the team working at the lab, instigating fear and paranoia and unleashing an uncanny horror on its victims. The focus of today's discussion is a philosophical perspective of the uncanny and what it means for understanding ourselves as human subjects. In Dylan Trigg's 2014 book, The Thing, A Phenomenology of Horror, he examines the body horror genre of filmmakers such as John Carpenter and David Cronenberg through the lens of a non-human or unhuman phenomenology. Dylan addresses one of the historical problems with phenomenology, which is the idea of a subject who arrives on the scene already solid and intact, a move which presupposes much else about the nature of our experience, our consciousness, and our perception. For this episode of Zer0 Books Archives, I caught up with Dylan to look back at his book, which in fact enjoys a broad readership, having been translated into several languages. In this discussion, we cover some of the ideas of Freud, Levinas, and Merleau-Ponty, while bringing in other figures such as Antonin Artaud, Gilles Deleuze, Nick Land, and Mark Fisher. In the end, we will also talk about some other writing that we will see from Dylan in the near future. Okay, let's check in with today's author. Dylan, thanks for joining me here today. We're talking about your book, The Thing, A Phenomenology of Horror. And I just wanted to start off with some basic questions. Let's talk about the basic problem that this book poses, which is how the area of philosophy known as phenomenology has historically succumbed to the failure of its own method. The inquiry into the nature of consciousness, perception, and experience has fallen victim to philosophers centering the human or figure of the human as its focal point. And in the book, you write this, and you put it very nicely. You say, against this horizon of speculation, the phenomenological tradition, once a beacon of integrity, has become emblematic of a failure in thought to think outside of the subject. Instead, the method purportedly reduces the world of things to an anthropomorphized world, enclosed at all times with an unbreakable alliance between subject and world. So could you talk about in detail how you view this problem and how you think horror films and horror tropes sort of tie into this idea of a non-human phenomenology?
Yes, thanks so much, Craig, for having me today and for reanimating this book and indeed for your questions, which are very, very rich, and I'll hope to do justice to them. So basically, I mean, the context for this book is twofold, and you point to one of those reasons there in this description of phenomenology as being very kind of human-centric. And so my background is, I classify myself, or I identify myself, as a phenomenologist, and in a way as a kind of, as a sort of traditional phenomenologist. I mean, in the school of Merleau-Ponty and Levinas, and later people like Bachelard, and then Ed Casey and Alfonso Lingas. So this sort of style of, fairly kind of descriptive phenomenology. Nevertheless, I have sort of reservations about phenomenology that were on my mind as I was writing this book 10 years ago, and to some extent still do have. And in a way, those sorts of reservations, I think, were to some extent brought to light and articulated by critics of phenomenology that were coexistent when this book was fresh. So here I'm thinking of people like Meillassoux, and also some of the thinkers that are associated with what was then called speculative realism. I don't quite know the state of it now, but those sorts of thinkers. But basically, so on a historical level, you have this idea of phenomenology as being a relational kind of methodology. So in other words, phenomenology places the subject in relationship to the world in an affective, spatial, temporal, intersubjective way. And this includes, the very concept of the earth itself. So you have this idea, of course, in Heidegger of being in the world, such that there's a kind of inseparable relationship here between being in the world and, again, according to this kind of critique that was topical 10 years ago, within a phenomenological framework, it's impossible to conceive of those dimensions as anything but a correlation, to use the terminology. And then in the kind of more specific terms, you have things like issues in Heidegger, for example, his analysis of anxiety, his analysis of death, where they are seen as opportunities for a subject to realize their own relationship to authenticity. And then yet again in thinkers like Merleau-Ponty, you have this sort of idea of intersubjectivity as a harmonious, fluid interplay between self and other without any kind of dissonance or without any discord. And this framework, this sort of idea of phenomenology as situating the subject in relationship to the world, in relationship to others, in a harmonious way, is taken up to a large extent in contemporary phenomenological scholarship, where you have a particular idea, you have like a particular formulation of the subject, i.e. a particular formulation of the phenomenological subject. And this sort of subject is characterized by a kind of a certain way of being in the world, a certain kind of bodily being in the world, where the body is one's own. And in other words, it's a sort of prescriptive phenomenology where, in my critical take on it, the research or the findings of the research are determined in advance, because there is this sort of tacit, covert, ethical set of values that is carried into the methodology that seem to be that never seem to be questioned. So this is the context. This is one context for my quarrel with phenomenology, where phenomenology has this sort of prescriptive element to it. It neglects, for example, certain types of bodily experience that don't seem to conform to this phenomenological mission, and it seems to venerate certain types of phenomenological experience and certain types of bodily experience that seem to articulate an ideal of phenomenology, and that has something that's something that's always kind of bugged me. And in one way or another, even prior to writing this book, I was interested in how different kinds of experience can contest this idea of phenomenology by using phenomenology against itself, by turning phenomenology against itself, by looking at sort of cases of anxiety, and in this book, horror, and later nostalgia, and themes like decay and so forth, by looking at how different affective states contest, the way this kind of anthropocentric, to my mind, rather normative model of phenomenology. And I mean, also just on this point, in contemporary phenomenology, you also have sort of phenomenological psychopathology, which again, while it looks at these sorts of experience, this sort of diversity of experience, there's a kind of tendency to use them to reinstate some normative sense of bodily experience as an I can, and then to sort of reinstate this sense of the body as one's own. So that's like one critical horizon that I was opposed to when writing this book. And then the other, as I say, is the sort of literature on Meillassoux and the sort of stuff that was coming up in speculative realism. I wasn't terribly invested in it, but I was, in a way, interested in the way in which it critiqued phenomenology and critical of it. And, the one thing that I think that they got wrong was that they completely neglected the body. So again, in a way, there was this kind of complicity with phenomenology itself by giving a caricature of the body, and they didn't attend to all these other kind of rich elaborations of the body that you find in Merleau-Ponty, not only in his early work, but throughout his career. And so I think that's the kind of motivation that I was definitely situated in while I was writing the book.
It's interesting that you brought up the kinds of phenomenology that are imported into therapy modalities. I'm thinking of like Dasein analysis, Medard-Boss, Binswanger, and I could see, for example, how the idea of a kind of subjective closure or certainty or solidity could be problematic for the kinds of things that we would want to accomplish politically, for example, or even existentially.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I think, the seeds of it, I think, are there in a way in Heidegger, because you do have this account of anxiety. And of course, anxiety is like the phenomenological mood par excellence. You have it in Heidegger, you have it in Sartre, you have it in Levinas, you have it to some extent in Merleau-Ponty. But in each of these kind of formulations, it's deployed as a transformative mood beyond others. And of course, there are other kinds of moods and affective states that feature in phenomenology: boredom, nausea, and so on, shame, and so on and so forth. But anxiety seems to be the key one that can play this critical role in transforming, especially within a Heideggerian context, a subject from this state of being complicit with das Man, the they, this kind of collective, to this state of individuation. And of course, you can critique that movement on its own terms as having some politically pernicious factor to it. But certainly, as you say, within the context of existential therapy and phenomenological psychopathology, it seems, indeed, there's a kind of tendency, I think, in phenomenology, in Heidegger and also in Merleau-Ponty, to move too readily and too hastily towards this sort of state of resolution. And I think, that's one of the things that I think there's a tremendous amount of research still to be done on, the sort of the gaps and the omissions that are left behind once we sort of pause that tendency within phenomenology to move towards this sort of state of restoring the world back to how we perceive it in the sort of life world tradition.
I think the next place that I want to go is I want to talk about a short paragraph that you have kind of at the end of the introduction of the book. Here's an excerpt from it. I have a question regarding the excerpt. It says, "An unhuman phenomenology, then, is a phenomenology that runs against the notion that description is the guarantor of truth, and thus strikes a discord with traditional phenomenology. In this way, unhuman phenomenology is a genuine alien phenomenology in that it is concerned with the limits of alterity rather than simply replacing subjects with objects." And now this is what interests me. I wrote here, it seems that the notions of subject and object themselves in some way motivate the problems that we're discussing, that these are presupposed at the beginning and thus carried over into the questioning. My question is, how can we understand this idea of alterity without at least suggesting such opposing concepts of subject and object? I should say, do you think that an idea of alterity is equivalent to an idea of otherness or something other than myself? I mean, how do we conceive of this notion of other without those concepts in mind?
I mean, I think that's precisely what I'm trying to do with this idea of unhuman phenomenology and the sort of unhuman body. And I take my inspiration here from Levinas especially, and I'm very much interested, or I was in this book, in the idea of what he calls the ilia, which is this kind of anonymous, pre-personal, impersonal plane of existence against which subjects come into their own life and form. And the critical point for him, and the critical point that I take from him, is that this impersonal aspect, this impersonal level of existence, is never integrated into life. It's always there as a sort of undercurrent that haunts us on a latent level, and then it comes into realization in certain affective states, such as insomnia and an experience of horror. Now, the reason that I use unhuman phenomenology in this context, thinking through Levinas, is that I don't, as I say, because I'm a phenomenologist, I don't want to do away with the body. It seems to me that we have this materiality which we have to contend with in one way or another. So I'm not kind of committed to any kind of post-humanism, which I think is establishes a sort of disingenuous relationship to the body. And nor am I particularly interested in this like formulating the body as something inhuman. So I want to contend. All of my work is in a way situated on the everyday experience of the body in this kind of almost like prosaic level of existence, whether it be through affective states or a relationship to spatiality, time, other people, and so on and so forth. But I'm interested, and again, this is why Levinas appeals to me, in the idea of impersonal, anonymous, elemental forms of existence inhabiting and speaking in and through the body. Okay, so I like this idea of retaining the body, of retaining phenomenology, but of disorientating, of disturbing it, of introducing this sort of element of latent horror within it. And it seems to me that you can only bring to light, you can only have this articulation of horror, or you can only have this articulation of a world outside of phenomenology, a kind of non-relational phenomenology, through an indirect access and through thinking about it in terms of the body as a host to these other experiences, to these other levels of existence that we indirectly have access to. So the reason, more specifically, is that with this idea of the unhuman, I'm playing, of course, to some extent on the Freudian idea of the uncanny, this idea of something that is repressed, something that is there all along, but is now coming to the surface.
Well, maybe we can unpack that for a little bit. Well, what does Freud mean by when he talks about the uncanny or the unheimlich?
Yeah, well, it's a rich question. So, I mean, basically, as I see it, the uncanny is this idea of like two or more contradictory ideas inhabiting the same space or the same body, in the case that I have it. One of those ideas in the Freudian kind of framework has been repressed, but nevertheless has been there all along, has been latent, but through some sort of, usually some sort of inadvertent kind of encounter comes to the surface. And this generates a kind of destabilizing relationship to our normative relationship to the world, to other people, and to our own body. So, you can see, of course, that it's especially rich to a phenomenological analysis of horror, and especially to the body, where on the one hand, you have this idea of the body as irreducibly one's own. We've sort of become very accustomed to this idea of not questioning the body, this idea of the body as a tacit, silent presence. And again, this is something that phenomenology has been very much committed to, this idea of the body as one's own. And there is, in the phenomenological research, a significant amount of tension on pathological states, on illness and sickness, when this sort of sense of the body as one's own is disrupted. But I think the Freudian analysis is a little more subtle, because it doesn't necessarily need those deviations from experience or those pathological modes to articulate it. It's something that is there all along and then brought into light in a more kind of enigmatic way. The uncanny is something that doesn't necessarily startle us or shock us in a state of kind of abject horror. It's this sort of eerie sense of that something's not quite right. There's a sort of quiet anxiety that something about my corporeal existence doesn't quite belong to me. So it raises questions here about, to what extent do I belong to my body? To what extent is my body constitutive of who I am? And to what extent is there a limit at which I cease being identifiable with my body? And all of those sorts of questions, they're very, very rich within horror. And in horror, you have this kind of amplified, dramatized betrayal of these kinds of states that are, of course, not always available to us in everyday experience.
I'm wondering at least where you might stand when the criticism is presented that one sense of alienation, one sense of horror, one sense of the grotesque is something that is socially constructed. And how does that factor into or against this notion of a sort of general or primary sense of non-human alienation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And obviously, this book is, I mean, I think, from the perspective of that question, this book can be criticized as being rather deprived and rather kind of decontextualized of those sorts of issues. It does tend, I think, to take this idea of the subject. It's a subject that is contingent, that is precarious, that in a way is exposed to this level of fragmentation that is not always available in phenomenology, but nevertheless, in a way, the subjectivity that you find in this book is like a neurotic subjectivity. It's a subjectivity that is sensitive to the dissolution of boundaries. It's a subjectivity that is, in a way, easily threatened by the advent of impersonal forces. So that, and of course, there's a question here of whether or not that kind of framework, that kind of analysis can be applied to a broader framework that is more attentive to political and sociological issues. And absolutely, I mean, of course, I think there's a case to be made here for certain emotions as having more as being more determined by sociological, by political factors than others. So, for example, shame would be one emotion in which, of course, that is where you have this very explicit relationship to sociological and political factors, as being, demonstrative of certain contemporary values and so on and so forth. Horror, I think, is a little more ambiguous in terms of its, if we talk about the history of horror, of course, there is a history of horror that is determined by a multiplicity of factors, but it's not quite as obvious as it would be for something like shame, and indeed for something like anxiety or even nostalgia, for example. The history of nostalgia is also having this kind of very complex history of something that is derided, for being a sort of whimsical self-indulgence, and then even prior to that as something that is, seen in medical terms as a disease, to something now against the backdrop of kind of media narratives as something that is celebrated and venerated as a source of pleasure. So I think it's an interesting question about where horror fits into that. And, I certainly don't have a clear-cut answer, but I think it's definitely a fascinating thought to pursue.
Sure. Yeah, it makes me think of, for example, like even the work of Deleuze and Guattari, Nick Land in particular, and Mark Fisher, of course, in the sense that they identify capital as a kind of non-human or inhuman, or that at least the emergence of capital depended upon, for example, the inhuman treatment of slaves, and in terms of the development of primitive accumulation, and then the emergence of capital as financial capital, and the models of capital that we experience in our time. But I mean, it seems to me like one of the challenges that I have with this kind of phenomenology is determining whether or not there is some sort of primordial sense of anxiety, for example, or some sort of primordial entity that we can call the non-human. Or is it the case that, as Deleuze and Guattari suggest, if, for example, capital is the limit, the exterior limit of our desire, what does that say about our anxiety, our sense of unsettledness, the constant sense in which the subject is slipping away, and how that becomes projected, beyond the individual, and it occurs as a kind of social event. But maybe we can talk about that through the lens of horror. I don't know if you have a response to that.
Well, I mean, I don't really have a direct response, but I in a way, I can understand the critiques made against phenomenology of this sort of description that you're providing, because what you do have here, and what you do have in this book, and what you do have in my work as just like one kind of symptomatic example, if you like, is in a way, again, to kind of extend the point I was making before, this idea of a subjectivity that is trying to retain coherence, and that is trying to, in a way, retain like this, like the sovereignty of being a singular subject. And it's not, it's not. It's a subjectivity that I am interested in exploring, and a subjectivity that I am interested in like dissecting, and in a way deforming. But put in this way, of course, I can understand the level. I can understand a critique, and I can understand like a level of hostility to that kind of phenomenology, where there is this kind of veneration of, and in a way, a kind of glorification of affective experience as the primary way in which the world is mediated. And and of course, like, it's not, you don't have to go like too far, like in the direction of Merleau-Ponty, of Levinas, to have this this kind of depiction of phenomenology in search of some like kind of primordial origin that in a way is stripped from the political world, the sociological world, the gendered world, as being made abundantly clear. And I'm not suggesting that it's a clear-cut picture, but there is this ambiguity, especially in Merleau-Ponty, where on the one hand, of course, he's formative in the development of what is now called critical phenomenology, this phenomenology that is attentive to the structures generating the emergence of lived experience in the first place. But on the other hand, there is this kind of like mythical quest that you find in someone like Merleau-Ponty, to say nothing of people like Gaston Bachelard, where there is something like a kind of primordial origin that is in question. And you have these kind of rich lectures on aesthetics that seem to play into this idea of like pulling apart, taking away the cultured world, the world of culture, and revealing underneath this kind of pre-human, this is Merleau-Ponty's terminology, pre-human layer underneath it. And again, there's of course been a lot of critique in feminist phenomenology of exactly this idea that is so critical in this book, this idea of like the pre-personal, the impersonal body, as denying gender, as denying difference, and in a way, contributing in a fairly kind of visceral way to the idea of phenomenology as being blind to otherness and to alterity. I think that phenomenology, or I think Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, is doing a slightly different thing. And I think, the contentious point is that, his phenomenology is, as it will culminate, is not really concerned with like the thematic organization of lived experience. He's concerned with the structure of it. So this is consistent with critical phenomenology, but he's concerned with the structure of it on a archaic level, i.e. in terms of how materiality, brute materiality, what he calls wild being, comes into existence as a specifically kind of human form prior to the division of gender, class, politics, and so on and so forth. And now again, of course, you can critique that as being like some mythical kind of search for an origin that doesn't exist. But I think it's a little more nuanced than that, especially when you get into Merleau-Ponty's later work, where there's a certain degree of sympathy and a certain degree of rapport with psychoanalysis and some elements of Lacan and so forth. So there's no easy answer, but I guess my only answer is that when we talk about phenomenology, of course, we have to talk about a plurality of different phenomenologies, and we also have to talk about the history of phenomenology and also its development as it is practiced now, because of course how it's practiced now is wildly different to how it was when Merleau-Ponty was writing.
Now, this makes me curious, because given your interest in Levinas, for example, I'm thinking about the book Ethics of Infinity, which is what's on my mind as I'm asking this question. What do you think the practical, and this is, I don't think this is in your book, but you've just made me curious. What do you think are the practical implications for ethics in general, for something like therapy, psychoanalysis, given the work in general on unhuman or non-human phenomenology, or what you have worked on here in this book?
I mean, I would kind of think about this like retrospectively through my own work, and I think like one of the things that phenomenology can enable philosophers and people working in the tradition to do is to encourage like a certain receptivity to otherness, to alterity. And I mean, for example, so you mentioned psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. I mean, so in the work that I've done on spatial disorders, on agoraphobia and various kinds of anxiety disorders, it seemed to me that so much of what was at stake in those anxieties was a kind of hostility to otherness, to alterity, to difference. All of these forms as destabilizing like a certain image of the self as stable and coherent and in possession of itself. And it would seem to me like from a pragmatic perspective, if you were to kind of situate phenomenology, and of course phenomenology is a big part not only of psychiatry but also of like forms of therapy and different kinds of treatment. That one of the things that that could be done or could be brought to the foreground is to think about the relationship to otherness, to think about the relationship to ambiguity and difference, with a view of cultivating a more, I would say, like malleable or elastic idea of the body and of the self that is not necessarily so rigidly interwoven with a set of structures that present the image of selfhood as being continuous. So in a way, trying to dismantle or alienate, the idea of the self as being singular and continuous, both spatially and temporally. I think, phenomenology, by practicing the methods that are inherent to it, and I think which are its strengths, which are particularly this sort of movement of alienation, of defamiliarization, there's certainly something that can be exported there to these kind of practices, possibly with some sort of therapeutic effect.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. Some of the reading and work that I have done was centers on the work of archetypal psychologist James Hillman. I'm not sure how familiar you might be with his work, but one of the challenges he puts to traditional psychoanalysis, Jungian psychoanalysis, and I mean more broadly construed therapy, is the notion, for example, that dream images or fantasies or any of the content that we might bring into a therapeutic space is something that can be squashed down and be made consumable as to preserve the solidity of the subject, as we understand ourselves. And he seeks to develop a relationship to images that sort of preserves images as an ecology rather than harvests them for a kind of utilitarian psychological purpose. So, I mean, in that sense, a lot of what you're putting forward in the book is really inspiring. I'm quite interested in the ways that we're able to apply this, whether as educators or as therapists and so on. So that's exciting. But what I'd really like to hear about now is horror films. And you have hit upon first of all, I didn't expect to see as much on The Fly as I did in this book. And I'm very happy about that, because that is one, I was a total horror buff as a kid, and that is just one movie that sticks with me. But maybe we can talk about first, before we get too far off track, is the works of John Carpenter, and why perhaps maybe you see him as a paradigmatic artist when it comes to the horror of non-human phenomenology.
Yeah, well, to be quite honest, I would probably reverse that and say that Cronenberg here.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, let's start with Cronenberg then.
Yeah, well, I would only say Cronenberg because I think, there's this ambiguity in Carpenter, because he explicitly disowns any kind of like philosophical or intellectual interpretation of his work, which of course raises like a series of interesting questions in and of itself, and certainly doesn't divest those films of content. But with Cronenberg, you have like this director who is explicitly identifies himself as an existentialist time and again, and obviously is fairly well read and kind of intellectually capable of articulating this material and transferring or integrating it into his films. And obviously, both directors' themes are returned to time and again, but certainly in Cronenberg you have this more kind of precise sense of especially the body. Of course, he's basically synonymous with this concept of body horror, and arguably has done the best to bring it to light and to do justice to it. But I mean, to take The Fly as an example, I mean, really this is like such a fantastic film and such a nuanced study of everything that is going on in this book. And certainly I could have written a whole book on that film alone. But to begin with, you have this idea of Brundle, the scientist played by Jeff Goldblum, as this like very outgoing character, and this already is very phenomenologically rich. You have this idea of this character who is relationally interwoven into his life, into his career, and is very expressive in his bodily gestures and all this sort of stuff. Very, in a way, has this strong sense of like strong kind of bodily sense, and of course Jeff Goldblum as an individual also does, and also in the way that he speaks. And then something takes place. You have this accidental splicing of the housefly with Brundle, and so this here you have like another kind of transition, phenomenological transition in the film, where as it comes to life, or as it comes to realization that these two organisms are spliced together, there's this identification, there's this sort of gesture of empowerment, and there's this gesture of like identifying with the animal within, the fly within, as a new form, as an extension of Brundlefly. So at this point, as an extension of Brundle. So at this point, there's no deviation, there's no fragmentation of the identity of Brundle, the scientist. But as the fly component becomes more prevalent within the organism, within Brundle as a human, there's this process of like assimilation, and it's no longer that Brundle, the scientist, is observing in this kind of detached third-person perspective what's happening to his body as a thing, but rather the organism, the alien, the other, is taken over, is becoming the sort of the more dominant agency. And at this point, the real, like for me, the kind of the crux, the philosophical heart of the film is this movement where you have these two agencies, you have these two organisms co-inhabiting the same sphere simultaneously, and it gives perfect articulation to what I'm talking about in this idea of the unhuman body, where there is the retention, the persistence of a human individual as witness to their own body betraying them, to this other alien force as becoming the more dominant force, while they themselves are still aware of this and still conscious of this, but pacified by it. And of course, there's this kind of very famous, quite beautiful scene in the mirror in The Fly where, he's like observing basically the decomposition of his own face, of his own body. He loses, teeth, nails, he loses the ability to speak, until the point where Brundle becomes Brundlefly, and then Brundlefly is completely taken over, assimilated by the metamorphosis of the fly itself. And what you're left with is this kind of amorphous, grotesque organism where almost nothing is left of Brundle himself. So, it's a very beautiful, methodical, kind of nuanced study of this transition and this transformation and the various kinds of affective and conceptual states that are involved, that are, in my estimation, kind of in a way already there in Merleau-Ponty. And of course, Merleau-Ponty has these very, very rich descriptions of things like phantom limbs, where you lose a limb. There's this sense of another limb as being present. You can't reduce it to like some kind of mechanical substitution or something, but rather, as Merleau-Ponty has it, it's this form of the self trying to preserve his or her relationship to the world on a pre-personal level. And it's, I think, a similar kind of structure that you see in a, of course, amplified grotesque sense in the horror genre, of the body departing, of doing its own thing against my own involvement. It's not something that I constitute. The body does it of its own, and that to me seems the horror. There's the essence and the genesis of body horror.
It was funny because as I was reading the exposition on the fly in the book, it had me thinking of the great theatrical auteur Antonin Artaud, whom you mentioned later in the book. And it seems to me that the fly body, or the fly becoming, if you will, is analogous to the non-organic vitality of the body without organs that he elaborates in his work, and then later Deleuze picks up. And I thought that was an interesting parallel, because in the fly, it's almost as if the human body and then this embodiment of the non-human that we see throughout the movie is not one of negation, but this sort of competing pure positivity that that leaves the human body, as you said, in this sort of rumpled mass at the end. But I'm curious as to, where you're at with this notion of the body without organs. I know a lot of the people who follow my work, would be very interested to hear what you have to say about Artaud, especially because you use it in the exposition of The Thing.
That's interesting. To be perfectly honest, I don't remember using it, but I mean, I think in a way it's, of course I'm aware of the concept and I'm aware of how Deleuze has used it, but I think in a way it's transferable to the context of The Thing, the book, and also arguably of the film itself, where what seems to be in question is this idea of the body without an eye, the body without identity. And of course, this is something that is emblematic of like the zombie film, where you have this kind of this living materiality, this living mass that is devoid of any subjectivity, that is devoid of any identity. And some of within the history of philosophy, of course, it's not anything new. You can find, the very idea, I think, of Cartesian dualism is in a way predicated on this idea of how do we conceive of the body without an eye? How do we conceive of the body without a mind? What do we do with this materiality? And then in people like John Locke, you have this idea of, again, within this sort of dualistic framework of transferring one identity from one body to another without any kind of implications or without any kind of knock-on effects in terms of the structure of subjectivity, the structure of identity. Horror films, it seems to me, do give articulation to this idea of the body as trailing off on its own intentional horizon, without the involvement, without the constitutional intervention of the eye, of the personal eye, and you are left with this materiality that seems to contest certain privileged ideas in phenomenology about the body as an I can, the body as something that is under the authorship of a singular subject. So,
the question I'm about to ask you, I'm not sure if I'll leave in the recording or not, because I don't have a fully formed thought around it. But as we started the meeting today, you said the word reanimate, which made me think of Reanimator, the classic film. And one of the very last things that I looked at in your book before we talked today was the scene in The Thing where we see the vivisection, right? And where the vivisection doesn't produce a host of organs, at least ones that we can judge and identify, but the whole scene devolves into this mass of amorphous subjectivity in this grotesque creature growing out of the cadaver of the being who's lying on the slab. I'm wondering to what extent this idea of reanimation or vivisection, how can we view or read the concept of non-human phenomenology through that image?
You mentioned there amorphous, and I think, of course, someone like Lacan is very attentive to the way in which language structures the experience of the body, and I'm sympathetic to that. Of course, I rephrase it through a kind of phenomenological lens, but I think, there is a sense in which the body has to undergo this constant work, has to undergo this constant process of personalization, either through artifice, through habit, through culture, through whatever kind of synthetic practice that we deploy, to enable it to maintain the status that it has, of having this kind of integral, unified image. Again, it's certainly to, I think, phenomenology's flaw that it has tended to present the body as unified and integrated from the outset, and it hasn't given too much attention to the way in which that kind of structure requires ongoing work, and is always prone and always vulnerable to a state of collapse, sort of collapse that I think someone like Lacan was way more sensitive to and gave greater expression to. So those sorts of scenes, and especially in The Thing, I think, what is so great about Carpenter's The Thing is that it is indeed like a film not only about this kind of cosmic horror, this idea of something coming from beyond and hosting itself within other subjects here on Earth, but also about the way in which the flesh is organized, the way in which the flesh, inhabits itself in other bodies and requires a certain degree of like human organization in order to domesticate. There's this process of domestication that takes place in order for personalization to be preserved. And it seems, of course, the horror in that film in particular, I think, is going on a multiple levels, not only in terms of, like this kind of societal horror in terms of breaking down the trust that we have with others, but also indeed in terms of the body as a singular thing losing its coherence and losing its form, and becoming one thing among many, let's say.
As you were talking, it just made me think how fascinating it was. I mean, of course, as viewers of films, especially those of us who grew up in the 80s, 90s, early aughts, we've been fully primed for certain kinds of scenes. And, thinking about, the prospect of opening up a corpse with a scalpel, for example. I mean, we know that something else is going to come out of there in a horror movie. And so it's interesting to think that there's something beyond the organization of the corpse as it lies dead, ripe for our analysis, right? That it's almost that we desire to see something else, something beyond what the body has for us as it is. So that's great. I love that. Well, maybe one of the ways that we can finish up, and by the way, I mean, I fully promote this book. This is just such a wonderful read, especially if somebody's just getting into phenomenology, or maybe they've read like Husserl or Heidegger and they've contended with the problems. I think this is a gateway into something different in that area of research. And also, I think for folks who do like stuff in post-structuralism and maybe have been leery of phenomenology, it's definitely worth checking out your book. And I think it could help out those kinds of research projects. But I'm curious what you're doing now. You talked about agoraphobia and nostalgia. Well, what's going on in that work?
Yeah, well, I just finished. I mean, immediately after I did The Thing, I spent quite a few years working on anxiety and agoraphobia. And in a way, there is this kind of close relationship between the topics of horror, anxiety. I think both themes involve, in a way, this sort of, this engagement with the process of personalization and this sort of the threat that impersonal existence presents to the stability of the subject. And in the work that I'm doing now on it's largely on the phenomenology of nostalgia. It's taken a critical look. It's slightly more slightly less phenomenological. So it's looking at the history of nostalgia as it has moved from a medical disease into an internalized state that was taken up in psychoanalysis, and now how it's taken up in this sort of commodified state in kind of many media narratives as something to be consumed and as this sort of feel good kind of mode of therapy. But I'm also in a way retaining like some of the phenomenological work that I've done by looking also here how nostalgia acts to negotiate with the alterity of time, for example, to put it in a Levinasian context, how it serves as a mode of like domesticating the otherness of time, how it involves time in terms of the constitution of selfhood, looking at its relationship to homesickness, looking at the concept of home, and so sort of things like that, but within a slightly kind of broader horizon and with a slightly sort of tweaked version of phenomenology. And of course, nostalgia is kind of a very, very topical issue now. So it's also taken up against the backdrop of COVID and to some extent Brexit. So those are kind of some of the themes I'm working on.
In terms of nostalgia, I mean, I think of the negative sentiments that Nietzsche had towards nostalgia, and then looking at the work of Mark Fisher in the concept of hauntology, for example, how the idea of a lost future or nostalgia might be a way to sort of unearth these tensions or intensities that have been long denied to us politically, and as a way to achieving some sort of new political project. Where do you stand on nostalgia? Are you on the Nietzsche side of the fence or the Mark Fisher side?
That's a good question. I think I'm certainly less optimistic than Mark Fisher in terms of framing nostalgia as a kind of utopian device that can enable us to imagine, other futures. I mean, I would say, but at the same time, I'm not, I don't want to, I think we need a kind of more nuanced treatment of nostalgia than the one that someone like Nietzsche would have in terms of, treating it as this kind of regressive mode of, retreating into history or into one's own past. Of course, it's like nostalgia is like horror, like anxiety. There's a multiplicity of different nostalgias, and it really depends on what we do with nostalgia, how we treat it, how we formulate it, how we conceptualize it. And from my own perspective, I'm interested in the way in which nostalgia is presented within the media and how it is experienced. I mean, the book that I'm writing in particular uses like interviews with people as case material to dissect the structure of nostalgia. So I think it's of course very, very hard to reduce nostalgia to having some sort of positive or negative value. I think absolutely it can be used as a sort of regressive mode of behavior that denies alterity, but it can also be, I think, used as a mode of venerating a certain idea of the past that we live in some sort of utopian or mythical hope of resurrecting. So, there has to be some sort of room for negotiation between these polarities of harnessing nostalgia as a critical mode of engaging with the past, while also recognizing, a certain degree of indeterminacy.
Well, Dylan, I just want to say thank you again for taking time out of your Friday night to speak with me. This is a retrospective on The Thing, a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. And who knows, maybe you'll be a Zer0 author again someday after your work on nostalgia.
Well, that's very kind. I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Craig, for your time and for allowing me the opportunity to revisit this book. It's been a great pleasure.